Geoffrey Chaucer lived a very interesting and eventful life. He lived in a period full of new things, full of happenings. For example, the Hundred Years' War. He was born, they think, around the 1340. Hundred Years' War with France had so many problems created to England. There was the Black Death that made so many victims. And in his life, then during the 30s, for example, we have the young and unfortunate Richard II that ascended the throne, only to be deposed and murdered a year later by Bolingbroke, the rebel who became then Henry the Fourth. Let's not forget, from a social point of view, that in 1381 there came the Peasant Revolt, with its recognition that the labourers and the diggers had the human rights quite as much as the middle class and the nobility. We suppose that Chaucer, in all this lifetime, died about 1400. Chaucer belonged to that growing middle class, if we can say it in this way, that so many writers gave birth towards this following period. He was not a peasant, he was not a priest, he was not an aristocrat, but the son of a man engaged in trade. His father was a wine merchant. But young Geoffrey was to learn a lot about the aristocracy of the time through becoming a page to the Countess of Ulster. Promotion and a foreign service as a young soldier. He, for example, was taken prisoner in France and then was ransomed by the King of England himself. Marriage into a family of the great John of Gaunt, for example, the opportunity to study sciences and arts, the literatures of France and Italy, from which he caught so many things. All these had to play a very important part in the formation and giving Geoffrey Chaucer all the means that then made him the great important writer that he had. Chaucer's achievements were so many, but I suppose that we should go directly to how the Canterbury Tales is organized to better overview all the great novelties that he brought to English literature. For example, the Canterbury Tales is a long work that was not finished by Geoffrey Chaucer. It was partly a new idea and partly an old one. We can say that it is a collection of short stories that had been so popular on the continent, which he came in contact to, for example, in France with the Roman de la Rose, or even in Italy, where he came in contact with the Francesco Petrarca, but surely came to know the organization and the stories of the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. The Canterbury Tales have given the English literature something that had never been done before. It is we can say, a masterpiece. It is not only a collection of short stories, it is also a collection of human beings of all temperaments coming from so many different social positions. It is a mixture, a mingle together that make them tell the stories and make these stories illustrate their own characters. Chaucer's work sparkles with drama and life. The temperaments clash. Each person in some way has his own way of speaking and narrating his story, has his own philosophy, and the result is not only a picture of the late Middle Ages with all its color and its variety, but it is the world itself. The pilgrimage on which the Canterbury Tales is structured, the pilgrimages were as much part of the Christian life in Chaucer's time as they are today. In England, when spring came, when the snow and the frost and the floods had left the roads of England and had made the traffic safe again, the people from all classes of society would make trips to the holy places. And one of the holy towns of England was Canterbury, where Thomas Becket, who we call the blissful holy martyr, murdered in the reign of Henry II, had his resting place. It was convenient for these pilgrims to travel to in companies, having usually met each other at some place, starting point, as for example in Canterbury Tales, they met at the Tabard Inn in London, and in that occasion, Harry Bailey, that was the landlord of the Tabard, and where he made the pilgrimage himself, offers a free supper to whichever of the pilgrims would tell the best story. The Canterbury Tales, in some way, is structured in three different parts. We could eventually say we have the general prologue that introduces all the characters and the setting of the work. The prologues that in some way introduce the individual tales, and then the tales themselves. The themes that characterize the Canterbury Tales are so many, just because the pilgrims came from so many different classes. The stories themselves were so different, and each of them belonged to a different culture, if we want. Some of those fundamentally are religion, for example. We have seen, if you remember, also a cartoon that regards the pardoners when he was selling a bone, pretending that it came from a holy place just to receive money. And the holy relics has been a problem for all the times in England. So it was a religion, it was marriage. We will see, for example, in The Wife of Bath, or love, chivalry. That's very important because this attitude of chivalric codes, if we want, are so much important in the medieval times. And not least, naturally, we have also the important element of magic. We can divide the tales into two parts, if we can say. The stories that talk about people, and stories that in some way are interested in animals. And in general, both of these collection of stories carry a moral message. The particular characters that are introduced in some way highlight also their philosophical aspects and the historical and cultural background that in some way characterize each social class. What we have in the description of the Canterbury Tales is that these characters in some way are drawn from specific social classes, the classes of his time. And it is also a quite important historical and social study that we have from the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. They come from, we said, from so many different social classes, from the rural to the urban backgrounds. We have the cavaliers, but we have also the people that are working the land in that particular period. They're all present, children, men, women, and all those that in some way can represent a particular attitude to the reality of the time. Important regarding Geoffrey Chaucer is the language. We must never forget that in the period that Chaucer wrote, we do not have a literature that can be compared to the literature that was in France or Italy. We have an old Anglo-Saxon kind of poetry with Beowulf and all those ideas that derive from the oral tradition that comes from Germany. We have seen in some way the collection of ballads that represent the characteristic of England in the times. But the literature with a capital L that we are used to, let's not forget that in Italy there have already been Dante, Petrarca and Boccaccio, with which Geoffrey Chaucer was acquainted with and he loved so much. some of the lines that also are referred to of Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. But let's stick to our language. There was the old Anglo-Saxon, we said, that was not fit for the great literature. We have, with the coming of the Normans, William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, in 1066, we begin to see a kind of fusion between these two languages of Anglo-Saxon and French that gave a certain importance and the variety and a sweeter sound to the English language. But we also have in this particular moment Latin that represent the literate way of conceiving. It was the language of the monasteries, and it was the language with which documents and histories were written. So we were saying that Chaucer wrote in English a kind of dialect that he got from the London area, but it was not did not have a great variety of vocabulary. So he had to create so many new words that in some way gave rise to the importance of English of the time. It was the language, Latin and French, that were used. For example, the French with in the courts with the noblemen, and the Latin also in the church and in the royal court. But with Geoffrey Chaucer, all these structures came to an end, and English, with the passing of time, became always more predominant. That is why Geoffrey Chaucer is considered and is called the father of the English language. What does he put in his language apart from the form that we have seen? There's a lot of irony. It is very lively because the characters are characterized by this kind of aspect. So even the language sticks to this kind of aim. There's a lot of humor. It is so humorous. We see this with the wife of Bath, for example, also with the partner, the